And today is the day that we start our Kingdom Cup deep dives, and holy cow. So this cup is going to be very, very interesting. Similar to, honestly, this early on, it's kind of hard to make predictions this early on, but from what I've seen, this looks like it's going to shape up to be a lot more like the Boulder Cup rather than the Twilight and the Tempest Cup. And that's only because there's two Pokemon that are really going to be hard to beat. And it kind of reminds me of a Medicham and a Skarmory type deal, where we have our subject for today, Lucario, and we actually have Bastiodon as our second one. So it really does end up seeming so far that it's basically going to be like Lucario and Bastiodon are required, and then you kind of have 4 slots to kind of pick and choose your counters to those Pokemon. However you may interpret that. We're actually going to start our Kingdom Cup deep dives with one of the two, and I will probably do a deep dive for Bastiodon early on as well, just to kind of get that ball rolling. And then from there, I'll start filtering through comments and getting your guys' suggestions. I really do like some of them that I've gotten so far, like Kingdra, Flygon. Those are the two that like really pop to the top of my head. Blaziken's another good one. I don't know if anybody suggested Monferno, but that's one that I was thinking about. Monferno and Fernape kind of thing. But I'm tallying those up and getting those ready to handle after I do these 2 top meta picks. So without further ado, let's actually go ahead and get in. Today we're going to be looking at Lucario, which is a fighting and steel type Pokemon, maxing out at 2703. If you have perfect IVs across the board at level 40, you can actually achieve 2703. You can actually hit 1495 at level 20.5 with a 1 on attack, 15 defense, and 15 stamina there. So that is a IV combination that really yields a really high stat product. I really like having a really high stat product here because it really ends up giving you the most of everything that you can possibly have whenever it comes to actually in-game matches. Now, in terms of my spreadsheet and my numbers, I've got Lucario ranked at 91st in bulk and 80th in stat product. So right off the bat here, you can kind of see that Lucario isn't necessarily like the best in anything. He's not like a super high stat product Pokemon. He's not a super bulky Pokemon. And he doesn't actually have really great potential. He actually gets like, I think he only like gets around like 50% of his potential, something like that. I don't remember off the top of my head. I stopped looking so much into potential and kind of started to focus in other areas here. You can kind of tell that Lucario's not like best in class when it comes to anything, which really means that the only thing that really carries him is his moves. His moves are really what takes him to a whole nother level in terms of the Kingdom Cup. So with that being said, let's actually look into those. So we do actually have our stab moves here color-coded with our typings. So counter being a fighting type move, 3.5 energy per turn, 4 damage per turn. Bullet punch being a steel type move at the same energy with 3.5, but 1 less damage point per turn. So of course counter is actually going to be preferred here. There's nothing wrong with counter having a whole extra energy. Whether you have fighting or steel type moves, they're both going to kind of do a similar job whenever it comes to what they actually are effective against. So there's not a really big issue with choosing like which move is better here. It's really just down to the straight up numbers. Typing isn't as big of an issue as it could be in other cups. Moving on to our charge moves, we do have Flash Cannon, Shadow Ball, Close Combat, and Power Up Punch. So Flash Cannon being a steel type move, costing 65 energy for 110 damage with a damage per energy ratio of 1.69. Shadow Ball being our only non-stab based move, which is a ghost type move for 55 energy, doing 100 damage for a 1.82. That is great to see there. Close Combat, 60 energy, 100 damage for 1.67. And our lone Power Up Punch here, the main bread and butter of our Lucario, 40 energy for only 45 damage, but a 1.14 damage per energy ratio. So, what actually really carries Lucario in this cup is the fact that he has counter and Power Up Punch. His moves are literally the only thing that makes him as good as it is. You could kind of count like his typing is pretty good as well. He does have a ton of resistances and stuff like that. But in general, the combination between counter and power-up punch really, really make him a huge threat in this cup in general. So in all of our deep dive glory, let's actually take a look at some positives and negatives here. We're going to start, of course, with our negatives. And I literally can only think of one negative connotation towards Lucario, and that's the fact that he can be kind of hard to obtain. The fact that you, one, have to get a Lucario, or two, you have to trade for one that's obviously, if you don't have one, you're going to have to trade, which is pretty costly. I personally think that you really want to go for trading for a Riolu rather than a Lucario, because Lucario's move cost bumps up really high if you're going to have two moves on this guy, and it really would be more beneficial to have a Riolu, which then means that you're going to have to turn around, buy a second charge move, which is going to be 25 candies on Riolu, and then you're going to have to spend 50 candies to evolve it. You're going to have to spend plenty more candies to power it up depending on which IVs you get and stuff like that. So really, really awkward situation for Lucario. He can be kind of hard to obtain. It is going to take some effort to actually get one if you don't already have one, but it's definitely well worth the cost. I can vouch that it is definitely worth that cost. And as soon as I get one, I'll confirm that. Moving on to our positives. So the biggest positive I do feel with Lucario is counter and power-up punch. Those two moves together are insane. The fact that power-up punch has a 100% chance of raising your attack power every time it's used really, really does take this damage for counter and really freaking boost it. So if you can imagine that you're doing power-up punch, and let's say you do enough stages to where you're doing 2 times your normal damage, you're going to be doing 8 damage every turn while still gaining 3.5 energy per turn. Then on top of that, you're going to be able to throw Shadow Balls out for 200 damage. Pending that my math is right, that's nuts. That's freaking insane. So there's nothing that you should really put on Lucario other than counter and power-up punch first and foremost. Now, depending on what you kind of want to do outside of that, whether you want Flash Cannon or Shadow Ball or Close Combat, I personally think that Close Combat can just kind of be taken out of the equation here, because power-up punch and counter are decent enough fighting moves on their own that once you start to get a few power-ups, you shouldn't have anything that's going to be weak to fighting really bother you. But Shadow Ball, I think, is probably the most interesting one here because it's going to hit most of the meta in a neutral way. I think it's probably the better bet. It does cost considerably less than both Flash Cannon and Close Combat. And it actually is going to do the same amount of damage as Close Combat. So, I mean, it's a no-brainer to me. It's got the best damage per energy ratio, hitting for neutral damage. Plus, with a stage or two worth of attack boost, you're going to be pushing even more damage than that. So, I personally think that counter, power-up punch, and Shadow Ball is probably the best situation that you can put Lucario in, unless you just really have a need for a Steel-type move, which I just honestly can't see one. Which, it's still early on, so maybe there is an actual issue for a Steel move. Anyways. Our other positive thing that I actually have down for Lucario is the massive amount of resistances that he has. So let's just list these off. Bug, Poison, Rock, Dark, Dragon, Grass, Ice, Normal, and Steel. Wow! 9 resistances is crazy. That's a ton of resistances that you carry on Lucario. And, I mean, the biggest deal is that Dragon and Ice are actually in that. So other Dragon-type Pokemon in the cup, other Ice-type Pokemon in the cup are going to have issues with you. And then you also carry a Steel resistance, so even the Steel-type Pokemon have issues with you. I mean, that's just... it's crazy. It's crazy how many resistances he actually has. Now let's move on to our matchups. So typically in my deep dives, I usually go over the top 10 bulkiest Pokemon. If you remember from the announcement of the Kingdom Cup video that I did, we talked about 2 Pokemon in the bulk list that were not even released, and one of them's not even obtainable as far as Great League standards go. So I did exclude those from this matchup list. What do we actually lose against whenever we fight with Lucario? So these are calculated with 0 shields and the preferred moveset that I chose, which was Counter, Shadow Ball, and Power Punch, okay? So we actually lose to Altaria, Skarmory, and Torkoal. Remember how I was talking about how Torkoal could actually, be good and then people would maybe complain about it? He seems pretty good going up against Lucario. Just first impressions, he seems really good. So we're actually losing to Altaria, Skarmory, and Torkoal is that's pretty good. I mean, considering that we're winning 7 out of 10, we're only losing to those 3, really does set up Lucario to have a really favorable matchup to a lot of different things. So here's kind of the other side of that. So what do we actually win against? We win to Bastiodon, Registeel, Steelix, Dugong, Regice, Lapras, and Fortress. So Bastiodon, he was, the other one that I talked about that's probably going to be the Skarmory of the Kingdom Cup. And he's got a weird situation where he's Steel and Rock, so that does make him 4 times weak to the fighting type moves. So he does kind of have that issue there. Registeel being pure Steel, he's going to be weak to fighting. Steelix going to be weak to fighting. Dugong going to be weak to fighting. Regice going to be weak to fighting. Lapras going to be weak to fighting. And Fortress going to be weak to fighting. So, as you can see, there's kind of a big benefit to having a fighting type Pokemon. And Lucario is probably the better fighting type to fit that role this month. So I definitely think that the matchups are definitely in Lucario's favor. And I actually ran some numbers. So when it comes to shields and how Lucario does with or without shields, I ran 4 different sets of numbers. So 0 shields versus 0 shields, Lucario actually wins 71.8% of the time. So that means in a scenario where Lucario is the last Pokemon that you have on your team, you and your opponent have already used all your shields, and you both end up with just 1 Pokemon left, you're going to win 71.8% of the matchups that you go up against. In that scenario, Lucario really shines whenever it comes to fighting up against Steel and Ice-type Pokemon. Those are the Pokemon that end up just losing hardcore to Lucario because he has such a really good, just a really good package whenever it comes to his fighting-type moves, plus his attack stat is just insanely high, and, he just does really good up against Steel and Ice-types. Next, we actually have 2 shields versus 0 shields. So the reason that I run this number is to figure out which Pokemon can just flat out beat Lucario in any situation. Pokemon that can take him down whether he has shields or not. And there's only 2 Pokemon that I really foresee this coming up against. That is actually Castform and Torkoal. Those 2 do amazing up against Lucario. And it's really weird to even talk about Castform being a thing. But it does really well. So 2 versus 0 shields, that actually ends up being a 92.3%. Like I said, Castform and Torkoal pulling it out there. Next, we have 0 shields versus 2 shields. The reason that we run this simulation is to figure out which Pokemon we can just flat out beat no matter how many shields the opponent has. And really what that comes down to is it's testing how strong your fast move is here. So counter is kind of the star of the show when it comes to this number. 26.9% of the Pokemon allowed in the cup are actually going to fall to Lucario. Even if they have 2 shields, you can just whittle them down with counter and you're just going to be able to just massively push out damage. The last number that we run is a 2 shields versus 2 shields number. We're actually winning 65.4% of the time in those matchups. So Lucario definitely has a nice setup. He's got a ton of stuff going for him. Well, let's actually talk about what counters Lucario and what Lucario is actually supposed to be used for. So things that are really good up against Lucario are going to be things like Alolan Marowak, Charizard, Castform. Of course, when I talk about Castform, I am saying the Sunny Castform. That's not the Ice type one, okay? Sunny form. Anything that has access to these really good Fire type moves are going to be doing really well up against Lucario. Alolan Marowak surprisingly does well, but it's not because he actually has Fire type moves. It's actually a Ground type move, Bone Club, which actually does really well against Lucario. The only problem is that whenever you're going up against Lucario and you have an Alolan Marowak, you have to really be careful because if you get hit with a Shadow Ball, he's just going to one-hit you. Like, it's really rough. Charizard does really well against Lucario because, of course, Charizard being a flying type, he is going to actually resist a lot of the fighting damage. and he's going to be able to deal fire damage back to Lucario for a super effective damage. And then Castform Sunny is just an odd Pokemon to even be talking about, but hey, he does good. He actually can beat Lucario, so keep that in mind. Lastly, what does Lucario actually need to be used for? You can use it for anything that Lucario ends up resisting. So all of the Pokemon like Scizor aren't going to have any issues. Poison type Pokemon, rock type Pokemon being like Bastiodon, dark type Pokemon like Sneasel and Weavile, dragon type Pokemon, grass type Pokemon. I mean, all of those matchups pretty much go to Lucario because counter is such a punishing move, and the fact that you have Power Up Punch is really going to be able to set you up for a ton of damage. So anything that is going to be resisted by Lucario, you have a really favorable matchup, and some of the neutral damage Pokemon out there can have a favorable matchup, but Lucario has such a widespread use case that there's not a whole lot that I wouldn't throw Lucario up against and feel uncomfortable about. As far as Lucario, do I recommend Lucario? Of course, yes, I recommend Lucario. I don't think that you are going to enter a cup this month and not see Lucarios running rampant. The only problem is that, like I said, he's going to be extremely hard to obtain, so I guess we all better get out there and start hatching some eggs, or at least finding somebody to trade with, unfortunately. Definitely recommend him. He is good as anything that you can really put him up against. Power Up Punch is a great shield busting move. Shadow Ball is going to be a great hard hitting move. He plays both roles really well. He honestly is like a Medicham from the Boulder Cup. He's going to be so good that you're going to have to run something to counter him, and then that Pokemon is going to be so good, Bastiodon, that we're going to have to run stuff to counter both of them. So it's really, really awkward. It's going to be kind of like the Boulder Cup all over again, but that's all I have for Lucario, guys. I'm still flabbergasted at how freaking good this kid is. It's insane. So, of course, if you guys have any suggestions, like I said in the beginning of the video, I am tallying up all of the deep dives that you guys are suggesting. I plan to look at them as soon as I finish my Bastiodon video, which I'll probably go ahead and record today and schedule it for tomorrow so that way I can start getting ahead on these again. But until then, let me know what you guys think. Let me know what you guys want to see, and I'll be happy to look into them for you. So, if you like to like videos, make sure you do that. If you don't, I don't care. You can be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in those comments below. And until our next video, I will catch you guys then.